The hunger in Eliza Johnson's stomach clawed at her insides like a wild animal as she crouched behind the general store in Silverton, Colorado, her trembling fingers clutching the loaf of bread she'd just snatched when the shopkeeper's back was turned. The year was 1883, and the promise of silver in these mountains had brought fortune to some, but only heartache and empty bellies to others. "Stop right there, miss," came a deep voice from behind her. Eliza's heart plummeted as she spun around, coming face to face with a tall man whose shadow seemed to stretch forever in the late afternoon sun. She'd been caught, and in a town where stealing could get you hanged, the terror that shot through her veins was colder than the mountain streams. The man before her wasn't the shopkeeper she'd expected, but a stranger with eyes the color of the Colorado sky. His worn leather vest and the revolver holstered at his hip marked him as one of the cowboys who sometimes passed through town. I was hungry," Eliza whispered, her voice breaking as she clutched the bread tighter to her chest. "I haven't eaten in 3 days." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, taking in her threadbare dress and the hollow look in her green eyes. Dust clung to her auburn hair, which hung in tangled waves down her back. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was a fierce dignity in the way she held herself. "Name's Henry Porter," he said finally, pushing his hat back slightly. "And I'm not going to turn you in." Eliza blinked in surprise, unable to process his words. "You're not?" "No, madam. But I can't have you stealing from good folks either." He paused, as if considering something. "My ranch is short-handed. I could use someone to help with cooking and keeping things in order." "You're offering me a job?" Eliza asked, suspicion replacing her fear. Men didn't offer strange women jobs without expecting something in return. Henry nodded, his expression earnest. "Honest work for honest pay. 3 meals a day and a roof over your head. Better than stealing bread and risking your neck, I reckon." Eliza hesitated. She'd come west with dreams of a new start after losing everything back east. The promise of regular meals was tempting, but trusting a stranger could be dangerous. "Why would you help me?" she asked, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "Because I know what it's like to be hungry," he answered simply, "and I believe everyone deserves a second chance." There was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity that made Eliza want to believe him. With no other options and winter approaching, she made her decision. "I accept," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eliza Johnson." Henry's calloused hand engulfed hers, warm and steady. "Miss Johnson, welcome to the Double P Ranch." Neither of them knew it then, but that handshake in the dusty alley behind Silverton's general store was the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The ride to the Double P Ranch was silent for the most part. Eliza sat behind Henry on his chestnut mare, her arms wrapped hesitantly around his waist as they traveled through the rugged terrain. The mountains stood tall and imposing against the darkening sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It's another hour to the ranch," Henry said over his shoulder as they forded a shallow creek. "You holding up all right back there?" "Yes," Eliza replied, though truthfully every muscle in her body ached. She hadn't ridden a horse in years, not since before the war took her father and brother, leaving her and her mother destitute. "We'll be there before dark. Mrs. Wilkins, she's our cook, will have supper waiting." He paused. "She's getting on in years, that's why I need the help." Eliza nodded, though Henry couldn't see it. "I can cook," she offered. "My mother taught me." Before she trailed off, unwilling to share that particular pain with a stranger. "Before she passed?" Henry guessed gently. "Last winter. Pneumonia." The words were clipped, hiding the depth of grief behind them. Henry didn't push. "I'm sorry for your loss." They rode in silence again until the land began to open up into a valley. The Double P Ranch spread out before them, not the largest spread in Colorado, but respectable, with a sturdy 2-story main house, a bunkhouse, barn, and corrals. Cattle dotted the pastures, and smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. "It's beautiful," Eliza said softly, taking in the peaceful scene. Henry's chest swelled slightly with pride. My father started with nothing but a few head of cattle, and his determination took him 20 years to build this place. And now it's yours? Eliza asked. For the past 2 years since he passed. There was a heaviness in his voice that matched her own when speaking of lost loved ones. My mother lives in Denver now with my sister and her family. As they approached the main house, a burly man with a thick beard emerged from the barn, followed by a gangly young man who couldn't have been more than 20. That's Frank Miller, my foreman, Henry explained, and the young one is Billy Thompson. There are 3 other hands who live in the bunkhouse. Frank eyed Eliza curiously as Henry helped her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. Boss, didn't expect you back till tomorrow, Frank said, his gaze shifting between Henry and Eliza. Who's this? Eliza Johnson, Henry replied. She'll be helping Mrs. Wilkins with the cooking and housework. Frank's eyebrows rose slightly, but he tipped his hat. Madam? Eliza nodded in return, suddenly very aware of her dirty dress and tangled hair. Billy, take care of Sadie, Henry instructed, handing the reins to the young cowhand. Miss Johnson, let's get you settled. The interior of the main house was warmer than anywhere Eliza had been in months. The smell of beef stew filled the air, making her stomach growl embarrassingly loud. A plump older woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun looked up from the stove as they entered. Henry Porter, you're early, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her sharp eyes took in Eliza's disheveled appearance. And you've brought company. Mrs. Wilkins, this is Eliza Johnson. She'll be helping you around the house, Henry explained. The older woman's expression remained neutral. Is that so? Well, girl, can you cook? Yes, madam, Eliza replied, finding her voice. And I can clean, mend, and do laundry as well. Mrs. Wilkins gave a small humph before turning back to her stew. We'll see about that. Supper's almost ready. You look like you could use a hot meal and a bath, not necessarily in that order. Despite the woman's brusque manner, Eliza detected no real malice. Thank you, madam. Henry cleared his throat. Mrs. Wilkins, would you show Miss Johnson to the spare room upstairs, and perhaps find her some clean clothes? I've got an old dress might fit her, Mrs. Wilkins conceded. Come along, girl. Let's get you looking human again. Eliza followed the older woman upstairs, casting one last glance at Henry, who gave her an encouraging nod. As she ascended the stairs, exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but the promise of food and a clean bed kept her moving forward. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. A window looked out over the valley, and Eliza could see the sun beginning to set behind the mountains. Bath will take time to heat, Mrs. Wilkins said, setting a folded dress on the bed. For now, wash your face and hands and come down for supper. We eat in 15 minutes. When Mrs. Wilkins left, Eliza sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her fortune had taken. This morning, she'd been contemplating which shop might be easiest to steal from. Now, she sat in a clean room with the promise of honest work. As she washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher, she studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Gaunt cheeks. Dark circles under her eyes, she looked every bit the desperate thief she'd become. But perhaps at the Double P Ranch, she could find her way back to being Eliza Johnson, the schoolteacher's daughter from Pennsylvania, instead of just another desperate soul in the West. By the time she changed into the borrowed dress, a faded blue calico that hung loose on her thin frame, and made her way downstairs, the cowboys had gathered around the large kitchen table. They fell silent as she entered, 6 pairs of eyes turning to assess the newcomer. Henry stood and pulled out a chair beside his own. Miss Johnson, please join us. Eliza took her seat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. The men resumed their conversations as Mrs. Wilkins began serving the stew. Men. This is Miss Johnson, Henry announced once everyone had been served. She'll be helping around the house. I expect you to show her the same respect you show Mrs. Wilkins. There were nods and murmured greetings around the table. Frank, the foreman, studied her with open curiosity, while Billy, the youngest, blushed when she met his eyes. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Porter," Eliza said formally, aware of the scrutiny. "I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," Mrs. Wilkins said, but there was less edge to her voice now. "Eat your stew before it gets cold. There's plenty more in the pot." That first meal at the Double P Ranch was the best Eliza had eaten in months. She tried not to devour it like the starving woman she was, taking measured bites as the cowboys discussed cattle, the coming winter, and news from town. "Miss Johnson, where are you from originally?" asked one of the hands. An older man introduced as Tom. "Pennsylvania," Eliza replied between careful bites, "near Philadelphia." "That's a long way to travel alone," Frank observed. "I wasn't alone when I started," Eliza said quietly. "Things changed along the way." Henry cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson has had a long journey. Let's not tire her with questions her first night." Eliza shot him a grateful look. The less these men knew about her past, the better. After supper, while the men retreated to the porch to smoke, Mrs. Wilkins showed Eliza the kitchen routine. Despite her initial gruffness, the older woman was thorough in her explanations. "I've been cooking for these men for 15 years, Mrs. Wilkins said as she demonstrated how to work the cast-iron stove. "Started when Henry's father was running things. These days, my hands aren't what they used to be, and my back gives me grief." "I'll do whatever you need," Eliza assured her. "I'm stronger than I look." Mrs. Wilkins eyed her skeptically. "We'll fatten you up some first. Can't have you collapsing in the middle of laundry day." By the time the dishes were washed and put away, Eliza was swaying on her feet. Mrs. Wilkins shooed her upstairs where she found a metal tub had been placed in her room, steam rising from the water. "The men brought it up while we were cleaning," Mrs. Wilkins explained. "Soap's on the chair. Breakfast is at 5:30 sharp." Alone at last, Eliza sank into the bath, the hot water both painful and blissful on her skin. As she scrubbed away weeks of grime, she let herself cry quietly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having survived another day, of having found a safe harbor, however temporary. After her bath, dressed in a borrowed nightgown, Eliza stood at the window looking out at the star-filled sky. The ranch was quiet now, the men either in the bunkhouse or asleep in the main house. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing through the valley. "Thank you," she whispered to whatever providence had led Henry Porter to that alley in Silverton. Then she crawled into bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and fell into the deepest sleep she'd known in months. The rooster's crow woke Eliza before dawn. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she hurried to dress in the borrowed dress, not wanting to be late on her first morning. When she arrived in the kitchen, Mrs. Wilkins was already there, stoking the fire in the stove. "Good, you're up," the older woman said by way of greeting. "Start cracking those eggs. Men need a proper breakfast before a day's work." Eliza quickly set to work, falling into an easy rhythm with Mrs. Wilkins. By the time heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, the kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee, bacon, and biscuits. Henry was the first to enter, his hair still damp from washing. He stopped short when he saw Eliza, as if surprised by the transformation. The hollows in her cheeks were still there, but clean, and with her auburn hair neatly braided, she looked more like the woman she'd been before hardship had reshaped her. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice a touch deeper than necessary. "You look rested." "Thank you, Mr. Porter," Eliza replied, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Mrs. Wilkins has been teaching me the routine." Mrs. Wilkins snorted softly. "Girl knows her way around a kitchen. Made those biscuits herself?" Henry's eyebrows rose in appreciation. "Then I look forward to breakfast even more." The other men filed in, and once again, Eliza felt herself being assessed. She kept her eyes down, focusing on pouring coffee and serving food until everyone was seated. "We're moving the herd to the lower pasture today," Henry announced between bites. "Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in my bones." "Your bones ain't old enough to predict weather," Frank teased, but there was respect in his tone. Henry grinned. a flash of white teeth against his tanned face. "Old enough to know better than to argue with Mrs. Wilkins, which is what you're doing by not eating those eggs she slaved over." The men laughed, and Eliza found herself smiling too. There was an easy camaraderie among them, a sense of family that made her chest ache with a mixture of longing and appreciation. After breakfast, the men headed out to begin their day's work. Henry lingered, helping himself to a second cup of coffee. "Mrs. Wilkins will show you your duties," he said to Eliza. "If you need anything, just ask. We don't stand on much ceremony here, but we treat each other with respect." "I understand," Eliza nodded, "and I'm grateful for the opportunity." Henry studied her for a moment. "Can I ask what brought you to Silverton?" "It's not exactly on the main routes west." Eliza's hand stilled on the plate she was clearing. "I was following work," she said carefully. "I had a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Denver, but she passed away. Her son wasn't as kind as she was." She didn't elaborate on how the son had tried to force himself on her, how she'd fled in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and what little money she could grab. "I see," Henry said, though she doubted he truly did. "Well, you have honest work now, and as long as you do your part, you'll have a place here." "Thank you," Eliza said again, meaning it deeply. After Henry left, Mrs. Wilkins gave Eliza a tour of the house, a spacious dwelling by frontier standards, with 4 bedrooms upstairs, a study, parlor, and dining room downstairs, in addition to the large kitchen where they spent most of their time. "Henry's room is at the end of the hall," Mrs. Wilkins explained. "You'll clean it weekly, but otherwise it's his private space. The study downstairs is the same dust and sweep, but don't rearrange his papers." "Of course," Eliza agreed. "Does Mr. Porter have a wife?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Mrs. Wilkins gave her a sharp look. "No, there was a girl in town he was sweet on a while back, but nothing came of it. Now, let me show you the laundry." The days at the Double P Ranch quickly fell into a routine. Eliza rose before dawn to help with breakfast, spent mornings cleaning and preparing lunch, afternoons doing laundry or mending, and evenings helping with dinner. Mrs. Wilkins, though never effusive, gradually allowed Eliza to take on more responsibilities, especially as the autumn chill aggravated her arthritis. Eliza learned the rhythms of ranch life, which cowboys liked their coffee strong and which preferred it with a bit of sugar, how to predict when the men would come in muddy from working in the fields and have hot water ready for washing, which shirts belonged to whom when sorting laundry. She rarely saw Henry during the day. He was always the first to ride out and often the last to return, his responsibilities as owner keeping him busy from sunup to sundown. But at mealtimes, she found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the way he always thanked her for the food, how he made sure the conversation remained respectful when she was present, the quiet authority he commanded without raising his voice. A month after her arrival, Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Henry riding in, his expression grim. He dismounted quickly, patting his horse's neck before leading it toward the barn. "Mr. Porter," Eliza called, concern etching her features. "Is everything all right?" Henry paused, seeming to notice her for the first time. Something in his face softened. "Cattle rustlers hit the Peterson place last night, took half their herd and shot their youngest hand." Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. "How awful. Is he—" "He'll live, but it was close." Henry ran a hand through his hair, dislodging his hat. "I'm organizing a meeting of ranchers tomorrow. We need to put a stop to this before anyone else gets hurt." "Of course," Eliza said, her mind already planning. "I'll prepare extra food for the meeting. How many will there be?" Henry looked surprised by her offer, then grateful. "About 10, I reckon. Thank you, Miss Johnson." As he turned to go, Eliza called after him. "Mr. Porter? Please be careful." He looked back at her, a question in his eyes, but he simply nodded before continuing to the barn. That night at dinner, the mood was somber. The men discussed the rustlers, theories about who they might be, and strategies for protecting the Double P's herds. Eliza listened quietly as she served the food, noting the tension in Henry's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when Frank mentioned that the sheriff seemed reluctant to pursue the matter. "Man's scared," Tom muttered. "These ain't ordinary rustlers. They're organized. And they're killers." "All the more reason for us to be organized, too," Henry replied firmly. "We'll set up night watches, 2 men at a time. And tomorrow, we'll see if the other ranchers are willing to do the same." After dinner, Eliza was washing dishes when she heard the study door open and close. Finishing her work quickly, she dried her hands and hesitated only briefly before carrying a cup of coffee to the study door. She knocked softly. "Come in," Henry called. Eliza entered to find him bent over a map spread across his desk, a pencil in hand as he marked locations. He looked up, surprise crossing his features. "I thought you might like some coffee," Eliza explained, setting the cup on the desk. "You seemed troubled at dinner." "Thank you." Henry's voice was gruff but appreciative. He gestured to the map. "I'm marking where the rustlers have hit so far, trying to see if there's a pattern." Eliza leaned closer to look, conscious of his proximity, the clean smell of soap and leather that clung to him. "They seem to be moving north," she observed, pointing to the marks on the map. Henry nodded, impressed by her quick assessment. "That's what I'm afraid of. The double P would be next in line." "The men respect you," Eliza said softly. "They'll follow your lead in protecting the ranch." Henry's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their blue depths. "I hope I'm worthy of that respect. My father built this place, but I'm still learning how to be the man he was." "From what I've seen, you're doing him proud," Eliza said with more boldness than she felt. A ghost of a smile touched Henry's lips. "High praise from a woman who's known me barely a month." "Sometimes an outsider sees things more clearly," Eliza replied, stepping back slightly, aware that she'd perhaps spoken too freely. "Good night, Mr. Porter." "Good night, Miss Johnson," he replied, his gaze following her to the door. "And thank you for the coffee and the conversation." As Eliza climbed the stairs to her room that night, she tried to ignore the warmth that had bloomed in her chest at his words. Henry Porter was her employer, nothing more. To imagine otherwise was foolishness of the highest order. Yet, as she drifted to sleep, it was his face that filled her thoughts, the strength in his jawline, the kindness in his eyes, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious demeanor into something that made her heart beat just a little faster. The ranchers' meeting the next day brought 10 men to the Double P, their expressions grave as they gathered around the dining table. Eliza and Mrs. Wilkins served coffee and fresh bread as the men discussed the rustling problem. "They're moving north," Henry explained, showing the others the map he'd marked. "Peterson's place was hit 2 nights ago. Before that, it was the Wallace Ranch, and before that, Simmons lost 15 head. And the sheriff still claims it's just ordinary rustling?" asked James Cooper, whose ranch bordered the Double P to the east. "Says he can't spare the men for a proper investigation," Frank replied with disgust. "Then we do it ourselves," declared Martin Webb, the oldest of the ranchers present. "Form a vigilance committee." The suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement, but Henry raised a hand. "Let's be clear, we're talking about protection, not vigilante justice. We organize night patrols, share information, watch each other's backs. But we leave the law to the law." "And if the law won't do its job," Webb challenged, "then we present them with so much evidence they can't ignore it," Henry said firmly. "I didn't fight in a war to preserve this country, only to throw away its principles when they become inconvenient." Eliza, passing by with the coffee pot, paused at his words. She hadn't known Henry had fought in the war. He would have been young, perhaps no more than 18 or 19 when it ended in 65. The meeting continued for several hours, with the ranchers eventually agreeing to Henry's approach-coordinated night patrols, regular communication between ranches, and continued pressure on the sheriff to take action. As the men prepared to leave, Eliza brought out the lunch she'd prepared: thick sandwiches, pickles, and apple pie still warm from the oven. "This is mighty fine cooking, Miss Johnson," Cooper complimented, helping himself to a second slice of pie. "Porter, you're a lucky man to have found such a capable housekeeper." Henry's eyes met Eliza's across the room. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "I am fortunate indeed." The next few weeks were tense at the Double P. The men took turns standing night watch, catching sleep when they could during the day. Eliza adjusted meals accordingly, making sure there was always hot food available for the weary watchmen returning from their shifts. One morning in late November, Eliza woke to find snow falling heavily outside her window. By the time breakfast was served, several inches covered the ground, and the wind howled around the eaves of the house. "Storm's going to be bad," Frank reported as he stomped snow from his boots. "Cattle are restless." Henry nodded grimly. "We'll need to check the herds every few hours, make sure they don't drift into the ravines." "What about the night patrol?" Billy asked, looking exhausted after his shift. "We keep it up," Henry said firmly. "Rustlers might see the storm as an opportunity." Throughout the day, the men rotated between warming themselves by the fire and heading out to check on the cattle. Eliza kept the stove burning hot with pots of coffee and stew ready at all times. Even Mrs. Wilkins pitched in more than usual, her concern for her boys overriding her arthritic pain. As dusk approached, the storm intensified. Henry and Frank were preparing to head out for the evening check when Billy burst into the house, his face red with cold and exertion. "Riders," he gasped, "at the north fence line, 6 of them cutting the wire." Henry's expression hardened. "Frank, get Tom and Sam. Billy, you stay here with Mrs. Wilkins and Miss Johnson. Bar the doors once we're gone." Eliza's heart raced as the men quickly gathered weapons and donned heavy coats. "Mr. Porter," she called as Henry checked his revolver, "please be careful." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Bar the doors," he repeated. "If anyone but us tries to enter, there's a shotgun in my study." Then they were gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. Billy immediately began securing the house, his young face set in determination despite the fear in his eyes. "They'll be all right," Mrs. Wilkins said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Henry knows what he's doing." Eliza nodded, trying to ignore the dread pooling in her stomach. She busied herself preparing bandages and hot water, just in case. The minutes stretched into hours as they waited in tense silence, jumping at every sound carried by the howling wind. It was well past midnight when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Billy grabbed the shotgun, positioning himself by the window. "It's them," he announced with relief after peering through the glass. 4 horses. "4?" Eliza repeated, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the storm. "There should be 5. Billy unbarred the door, and the men stumbled in, bringing gusts of snow and bitterly cold air with them. Frank and Tom supported Sam between them, blood staining the side of his coat. "Where's Mr. Porter?" Eliza demanded, rushing forward. Frank's grim expression told her everything before he spoke. "Still out there. One of the rustlers fled north. Henry went after him." "In this storm?" Eliza's voice rose with panic. "He'll freeze to death." "Had no choice," Frank explained as they lowered Sam onto the sofa. "The man saw Henry's face. If he gets back to the others—" "Sam needs tending," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted, already examining the wound in the cowboy's side. "Bullet went clean through, thank the Lord." Eliza helped Mrs. Wilkins treat Sam, but her mind was with Henry, out in the blizzard pursuing a dangerous man alone. As she worked, she prayed as she hadn't since her mother fell ill, desperate, bargaining prayers that promised anything if only Henry would return safely. With Sam bandaged and resting, the waiting resumed. Frank and Tom took turns watching at the window, while Billy dozed fitfully in a chair. Mrs. Wilkins eventually retreated to her room, claiming she needed to rest her back, but Eliza knew the older woman simply couldn't bear the tension of waiting any longer. Eliza remained by the fire, adding logs whenever it began to dim. The storm showed no signs of abating, and as the hours passed, her hope dwindled like the flames when the wood ran low. It was nearly dawn when a heavy thud against the front door startled them all awake. Frank had his gun drawn before he reached the door, cautiously pulling it open. Henry half fell into the room, supporting himself against the door frame. His face was deathly pale, except for patches of angry red where the wind had burned his skin. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows, and his hands were blue with cold. "Henry!" Eliza cried, rushing forward as Frank helped him inside. "Get him by the fire," she ordered, her fear giving way to determination. Billy, more blankets. Tom, help me get these frozen clothes off him. Henry was barely conscious as they worked, his body violently shivering. Eliza sent the men from the room once Henry was down to his underclothes, covering him with blankets and kneeling beside him. "Mr. Porter," she called, taking his frigid hands between her warm ones. "Henry, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding her face. "Eliza," he murmured, using her first name for the first time. "The rustler." "Hush now," she soothed, rubbing his hands gently. "You need to warm up." "Got away," Henry continued stubbornly, "but I recognized him. It's Harris from the saloon in Silverton, working with others." "We'll worry about that later," Eliza insisted, alarmed by how cold his skin remained. "Right now, you need to focus on warming up." She heated bricks in the oven, wrapping them in cloth and placing them at his feet and sides. Gradually, color returned to his face, and his shivering subsided. As dawn broke, casting weak light through the windows, Henry fell into an exhausted sleep. Eliza stayed by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest, relief making her light-headed. Frank found her there when he came to check on Henry. "You should rest, Miss Johnson," he said gently. "We can watch over him." Eliza shook her head. "I'll stay a little longer." Frank's knowing look made her blush, but he didn't press the issue. "He's lucky you were here," was all he said before leaving them alone again. When Henry finally woke around noon, it was to find Eliza dozing in a chair beside him, her hand still loosely holding his. He studied her face for a long moment, the gentle curve of her cheek, the long lashes resting against her skin, the strand of auburn hair that had escaped her braid. Something shifted in his chest as he watched her, a feeling he'd been trying to ignore since the day he found her in that alley in Silverton. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he squeezed her hand. Eliza's eyes opened immediately, relief flooding her features when she saw him awake. "Thank God," she whispered. "How do you feel?" "Like I tangled with a grizzly and lost," Henry admitted, his voice rough. "But I'll live thanks to you." Eliza blushed, suddenly aware that she was still holding his hand. She started to pull away, but Henry held on. "Stay," he said softly. "Please." And so she did as the storm outside finally began to abate and something new and fragile bloomed between them in the quiet warmth of the Double P Ranch. The rustling incident changed things at the Double P. With Henry's identification of Harris, the sheriff finally took action, arresting the man in Silverton and extracting the names of his accomplices. Within a week, the entire gang was behind bars, and the ranchers of the area breathed easier. But the most significant change was between Henry and Eliza. Nothing was said openly. They were both too cautious, too aware of their positions, but small gestures spoke volumes. Henry lingered over breakfast, asking Eliza about her day's plans. Eliza found excuses to bring coffee to the study in the evenings, where their conversations stretched longer each time. The cowboys exchanged knowing glances but kept their comments to themselves, at least within hearing. Mrs. Wilkins watched with a mixture of approval and concern, occasionally reminding Eliza with meaningful looks that emotions could complicate a working arrangement. As Christmas approached, the mood at the ranch lifted. The worst of the early winter storms had passed, the rustlers were awaiting trial, and preparations for the holiday brought a festive atmosphere to the Double P. "My mother and sister are coming from Denver for Christmas," Henry announced at breakfast one morning in mid-December. "They'll be here for a week." The news sent Eliza into a flurry of activity. The guest rooms were aired and cleaned, special ingredients ordered from town, and every surface of the house polished until it gleamed. "You're working yourself to exhaustion," Mrs. Wilkins observed as Eliza scrubbed the parlor floor for the second time. "The house is clean enough." "I want everything to be perfect," Eliza replied, sitting back on her heels. "This is Mr. Porter's family." Mrs. Wilkins gave her a shrewd look. "And you want to impress them, or him." Eliza's cheeks flushed. "I just want to do my job well." The older woman hummed skeptically. "Well, Don't wear yourself out before they even arrive. There's still cooking to be done. 2 days before Christmas, a carriage arrived bearing Henry's mother, Margaret Porter, a dignified woman in her 60s with Henry's same blue eyes, and his sister Catherine, her husband James, and their 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7. Eliza hung back as Henry greeted his family with warm embraces, feeling suddenly out of place. Who was she, after all, but an employee, a woman Henry had caught stealing bread? The distance between their stations seemed insurmountable in that moment, but then Henry turned, seeking her out with his eyes. "Mother, Catherine, this is Miss Eliza Johnson, who keeps us all fed and the house in order." "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Johnson," Margaret Porter said, her assessing gaze taking in Eliza's neat appearance. "My son speaks highly of you in his letters." "He does?" Eliza couldn't hide her surprise. "Indeed," Margaret confirmed with a small smile. "He credits you with saving his life during that dreadful storm." "I only did what anyone would have done," Eliza demurred, though warmth spread through her at the knowledge that Henry had written about her. "Well, I'm grateful," Catherine said, stepping forward to clasp Eliza's hands. "My brother is too stubborn for his own good sometimes. It's good to know someone is looking after him." The days leading up to Christmas were filled with activity. The children, Emma and Robert, followed Eliza around as she worked, full of questions about ranch life. Eliza found herself enjoying their company, having always loved children. She taught Emma to make simple cookies and showed Robert how to properly polish boots, much to the amusement of his father. On Christmas Eve, after the younger children were asleep, the adults gathered in the parlor. Frank played carols on the old piano, and even Mrs. Wilkins joined them, her usual severity softened by the holiday spirit and perhaps the glass of sherry she sipped. Eliza sat slightly apart, watching the family interactions with a mixture of joy and wistfulness. It had been so long since she'd experienced such warmth, such belonging. Her own family Christmases seemed like distant memories from another life. "You look deep in thought," Henry said, taking the seat beside her. Eliza smiled. "Just remembering Christmases past. Good memories, I hope." "Yes," she nodded. "My father would read a Christmas carol aloud every Christmas Eve. My mother would make cinnamon bread, and the house would smell like spice for days." Henry's expression softened. "You miss them?" "Every day," Eliza admitted. "But this is lovely too. Your family is wonderful." "They like you," Henry said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Especially my mother, which is no small feat. She can be quite particular about most things." Eliza laughed softly. "I noticed. She rearranged the china cabinet this morning." Henry grimaced. "Old habits. She ran this house for 30 years. "And now I'm the interloper," Eliza teased gently. "No," Henry said, his tone suddenly serious. "You belong here, Eliza, more than you know." Before she could respond, Catherine called Henry over to settle a dispute about the lyrics to "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," and the moment passed. But Eliza carried his words with her like a talisman, taking them out to examine when she was alone that night. You belong here. Was it possible? Could she find a permanent home at the Double P, not just as an employee, but as something more? Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Eliza rose early to help Mrs. Wilkins prepare breakfast before the family gathered to exchange gifts. She had used some of her wages to purchase small tokens for everyone: handkerchiefs for the men, hair ribbons for Emma, a carving knife for Robert, a lace collar for Catherine, and a fine teacup for Margaret. For Henry, she had agonized the longest before deciding on a journal bound in soft leather, with his initials discreetly stamped on the cover. It had cost nearly a month's wages, but when she'd seen it in the Silverton General Store during a rare trip to town, she hadn't been able to resist. She hadn't expected gifts in return, and was surprised when each of the Cowboys presented her with small tokens: candy from Billy, a pretty comb from Tom, a book of poetry from Frank. Mrs. Wilkins gave her a warm shawl she'd knitted herself, and the Porter family had included her in their gift-giving as well, with Margaret presenting her with a lovely brooch that belonged to my mother and should go to a young woman who will appreciate it. Henry's gift was the last, handed to her with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. The small package contained a silver pendant in the shape of a key hanging on a delicate chain. "It's beautiful," Eliza breathed, touching it reverently. "It reminded me of you," Henry said quietly. "Strong, but elegant." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "Perhaps later you might join me for a walk. There's something I'd like to discuss." Eliza's heart raced, but she managed a composed nod. "I'd like that." The morning passed in a blur of festivity, with the children's excitement, a lavish Christmas dinner, and songs around the piano. By late afternoon, when Henry caught her eye and nodded toward the door, Eliza's nerves were stretched taut with anticipation. They bundled up against the cold and walked in companionable silence until they reached a small rise overlooking the ranch. The setting sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose, the mountains standing majestic against the darkening sky. "I've always loved this view," Henry said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "My father brought me here when I was a boy, told me that someday all this would be mine to protect and nurture." "You've done him proud," Eliza said softly. Henry turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I hope so. But lately I've been thinking that a legacy is about more than land and cattle. It's about family, about creating something that lasts beyond oneself." Eliza's heart quickened at his words. "That's true. When I found you that day in Silverton," Henry continued, "I never imagined how much you would come to mean to this place, to me." He took a deep breath. "Eliza, I know it hasn't been long, and perhaps this is too forward, but I find myself thinking about you constantly. Your smile, your courage, the way you've made the Double P feel like a true home again." Eliza could barely breathe as he took her gloved hands in his. "I'm not asking for an answer today," Henry said, his voice low and earnest, "but I wanted you to know that my feelings for you go far beyond employer and employee. If you could consider, if you might someday see me as someone who could court you properly, with honorable intentions." "Henry," Eliza interrupted, joy making her bold, "are you asking permission to court me?" A smile broke across his face, transforming it. "I suppose I am, rather clumsily." "Then yes," Eliza said simply. "I would very much like to be courted by you, Henry Porter." His smile widened, and he lifted one hand to gently touch her cheek. "May I kiss you, Eliza Johnson?" In answer, she rose on tiptoes, her lips meeting his in a kiss that warmed her more thoroughly than any fire could have. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, both tender and filled with promise. When they finally parted, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Eliza." "Merry Christmas, Henry," she whispered back, knowing that no gift could ever match the one he'd given her that day, the gift of hope, of a future she'd thought forever lost. Hand in hand, they walked back to the ranch, where lights glowed warmly in the windows and the sound of laughter spilled out into the winter evening. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza felt truly at home. Spring came early to the Colorado mountains that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. The Double P Ranch humbled with activity as calving season began, keeping everyone busy from dawn until dusk. The courtship between Henry and Eliza progressed at a measured pace, respectful of propriety, yet growing deeper with each passing week. They rode together on Sunday afternoons, Henry teaching Eliza to handle a horse with confidence again. In the evenings, they often sat in the parlor, reading aloud to each other or simply talking until Mrs. Wilkins pointedly announced it was time for her to retire, her way of reminding them to maintain proper decorum. The Cowboys adjusted to the changed dynamic with good humor. Billy blushed whenever he caught them in a private moment, while Frank took to clearing his throat loudly before entering a room. Tom simply grinned and tipped his hat whenever Henry stood a little too close to Eliza or let his hand linger on hers a moment too long. In April, Henry had to travel to Denver on business. "I'll be gone 2 weeks at most," he promised Eliza the night before his departure. They stood on the porch, enjoying the mild evening air, his arm wrapped around her waist. "Frank will handle things here." "I'll miss you," Eliza admitted, leaning into his embrace. Over the months, she had grown more comfortable expressing her feelings, shedding the protective reserve that hardship had taught her. "I'll miss you more," Henry replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I have important matters to attend to in Denver." "Cattle contracts?" Eliza asked, turning to face him. A mysterious smile played at Henry's lips. "Among other things." The 2 weeks of Henry's absence dragged by. Eliza kept herself busy with spring cleaning, turning out every room in the house with an energy that even Mrs. Wilkins commented on. "You're wearing out the floorboards with all that scrubbing," the older woman observed dryly. "I want everything to be perfect when Henry returns," Eliza explained, pushing a strand of hair from her flushed face. Mrs. Wilkins harumphed. "That man wouldn't notice if the floors were made of gold. He only has eyes for you." The comment made Eliza smile, though she continued her cleaning with undiminished enthusiasm. Henry returned on a Saturday afternoon, riding in just as Eliza was hanging the last of the laundry. She spotted him from the clothesline and had to restrain herself from running to meet him like an eager child. Instead, she continued her task, though her hands trembled slightly with anticipation. He found her there, reaching up to pin a sheet to the line, the spring breeze molding her dress to her figure. For a moment, he simply watched, his heart swelling with emotion. "That looks like my job," he said finally, stepping forward to take the wooden pin from her fingers. Eliza turned, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Henry, welcome home." The word home hung between them, weighted with meaning. Henry secured the sheet before turning back to her, taking both her hands in his. "I missed you," he said simply. "And I you." Eliza studied his face, noting the tired lines around his eyes, but also the barely contained excitement in his expression. "You look like a man with a secret." Henry laughed. "You know me too well already." He glanced toward the house. "Is anyone inside?" "Mrs. Wilkins is visiting her sister in town. The men are out with the herd." "Good." Henry led her to the porch steps, sitting beside her. "I have something for you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as he placed it in her palm. "Open it," he encouraged softly. With trembling fingers, Eliza lifted the lid to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant band of gold set with a small diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "It was my grandmother's," Henry explained, his voice husky with emotion. "My mother gave it to me in Denver. She said it should go to the woman who has captured my heart so completely." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as Henry took the ring from the box and held it poised at the tip of her finger. "Eliza Johnson," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "When I found you that day in Silverton, I thought I was offering you a chance at honest work. I never imagined you would steal my heart so thoroughly in return." He smiled at his own words. "I love you, Eliza. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Eliza's tears spilled over, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Henry Porter, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. When they finally parted, Eliza rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would find this," she confessed. "After everything, I'd given up hope." "And now?" Henry asked, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "Now I believe in second chances," Eliza said, her eyes shining with joy, "in new beginnings, in love that comes when you least expect it." Henry kissed her again, sealing their engagement with a tenderness that held the promise of a lifetime together at the Double P Ranch. The news of their engagement spread quickly. Mrs. Wilkins, returning from town, took one look at the ring on Eliza's finger and declared, About time. Though her gruff manner couldn't hide her pleasure, the cowboys offered hearty congratulations, Frank going so far as to suggest they'd all seen it coming since Christmas. Letters were sent to Henry's mother and sister in Denver, and plans for a June wedding began to take shape. Margaret Porter wrote back immediately, expressing her delight and promising to handle many of the arrangements. She wants to be certain everything is done properly, Henry explained with a hint of apology as he read his mother's detailed letter outlining her plans for the ceremony. Eliza laughed. I'm grateful for her help. I wouldn't know where to begin with planning a society wedding. Henry's expression grew serious. It doesn't have to be elaborate. What matters is that we're together. I know, Eliza assured him, squeezing his hand, but your mother's excited, and I want her to be happy too. She's welcoming me into your family so warmly. As the wedding date approached, the Double P became a hive of activity. The main house was scrubbed until it gleamed, and the bunkhouse received similar treatment to accommodate the overflow of guests. A new dress arrived from Denver, cream-colored silk, with delicate lace trim, more elegant than anything Eliza had ever owned. You look like an angel, Mrs. Wilkins declared gruffly when Eliza tried it on, her eyes suspiciously bright. The day before the wedding, guests began arriving, ranchers and their wives from neighboring properties, Henry's mother and sister's family from Denver, even the sheriff and his wife from Silverton. Eliza, overwhelmed by the growing crowd, sought refuge in the kitchen, baking obsessively until Mrs. Wilkins shooed her out. You're the bride, not the help, the older woman scolded. Go make yourself pretty for tomorrow. That evening, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Eliza slipped outside to the porch. The night was warm, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds. She breathed deeply, trying to calm the mixture of joy and nerves fluttering in her stomach. Couldn't sleep either. Henry's voice came from the shadows. He stepped forward, moonlight illuminating his features. It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, Eliza teased, though she made no move to leave. Henry closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. I'll risk it. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Having second thoughts? No, Eliza said immediately, then smiled. Well, perhaps about letting your mother invite half of Colorado to witness our vows. Henry chuckled. There's still time to elope. And face Mrs. Wilkins's wrath? I think not. Eliza's expression softened. Besides, I want to stand before everyone we care about and promise myself to you. I'm proud to become your wife, Henry Porter. Henry lifted her hand to his lips. And I'm the luckiest man in Colorado to call you mine. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the ranch that would be their shared legacy, until the night chill finally drove them back inside to their separate rooms for one last night apart. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was held outdoors, beneath an arch of wildflowers constructed by the cowboys. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows, occupied now by friends and neighbors in their Sunday best. Eliza stood at the back, her arm linked with Frank's, the foreman, having agreed to give her away in the absence of her father. Her cream-colored dress caught the sunlight, and wildflowers were woven into her auburn hair, which hung in loose curls down her back. Ready, Miss Johnson? Frank asked, an uncharacteristic tenderness in his voice. Though I reckon this is the last time I'll call you that. Eliza took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Henry waiting at the altar, tall and handsome in his best suit. I've been ready since the day he found me in that alley, she replied softly. The small band of local musicians began to play, and Eliza walked toward her future. Each step bringing her closer to the man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Eliza was aware of the minister's words, of the weight of the gold band as Henry slid it onto her finger next to her engagement ring, of the tears in Margaret Porter's eyes as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman he loved. But most of all, she was aware of Henry, his steady gaze, the slight tremor in his hands that revealed his own emotion, the love that radiated from him like heat from a flame. I now pronounce you man and wife, the minister declared at last. You may kiss your bride. Henry's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a testament to the journey that had brought them to this moment and the life they would build together. As they turned to face their guests, now as Mr. and Mrs. Porter, Eliza felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables had been set up near the house, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Wilkins and helpers from town. Lanterns cast a golden glow over the festivities as the sun set behind the mountains. There was dancing Eliza's first dance as a married woman held securely in her husband's arms and toasts, and laughter that echoed across the valley. When they finally slipped away to the main house, now theirs alone, Mrs. Wilkins having moved temporarily to the guest cabin to give them privacy, Eliza felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Happy, Mrs. Porter?" Henry asked as he closed their bedroom door behind them. "Completely," Eliza answered, reaching up to loosen his tie. "Though it still feels strange to hear my new name." "You'll have a lifetime to get used to it," Henry promised, his hands gentle as he helped her remove the flowers from her hair. Their first night as husband and wife was everything Eliza had dreamed of, tender, passionate, and filled with whispered promises for the future they would build together. As she drifted to sleep in Henry's arms, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate thief to beloved wife, from hunger to abundance, from loneliness to belonging. The years that followed were not without challenges. Running a ranch in the Colorado mountains required hard work and resilience. There were drought seasons that threatened the cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, and the ordinary trials of building a life together. But there was joy, too, in abundance. The birth of their first child, a son they named James, after Henry's father just 10 months after their wedding. The satisfaction of seeing the Double P prosper under their joint stewardship. The deepening of their love as they faced each challenge together. Mrs. Wilkins eventually retired, though she refused to leave the ranch, taking up permanent residence in the guest cabin where she continued to offer unsolicited advice and occasional help with the children. The Cowboys remained loyal, with Frank serving as godfather to James, and later to the twins, Elizabeth and Thomas, who arrived 2 years after their brother. On the 5th anniversary of the day Henry had found Eliza in that Silverton alley, they stood together on the rise overlooking the ranch, their children playing nearby under the watchful eye of Catherine, who had come to visit with her family. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Eliza asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "If you hadn't come along when you did, if you had turned me in instead of offering me work." Henry wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I prefer to think about how things did turn out, about the amazing wife and mother you've become, about our children, about the life we've built." Eliza smiled, turning in his embrace to face him. "I stole a loaf of bread, and you gave me a feast in return." "As I recall," Henry said with a grin, "you stole something else too." "What was that?" "My heart," he replied, lowering his head to kiss her. "And I've never wanted it back." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the landscape in the same golden hues as on their wedding day, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From desperation to joy, from hunger to fulfillment, from a chance encounter to a love that would last a lifetime. The Double P Ranch flourished under their care, becoming not just a successful cattle operation, but a true home, a place where their children grew up strong and kind, where neighbors found welcome in times of need, where the legacy of hard work and compassion that Henry's father had begun continued to thrive. And at the heart of it all was the love between a woman who had once been desperate enough to steal, and a man whose greatest theft had been committed not by his hand, but by his heart, as he found himself robbed of it completely by the very woman he had saved. In the years to come, when their children asked for the story of how their parents met, Henry would always begin with a wink at Eliza and the words, "Well, your mother was the most beautiful thief I ever caught," And Eliza would laugh and add, "But your father was the real thief that day." And together they would tell the tale of bread stolen and hearts given, of second chances and new beginnings, of a love that had started in an unlikely moment but had grown to fill their lives with more joy than either could have imagined possible. As James grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's steady nature, and the twins developed their own distinct personalities. Elizabeth with her mother's determination, and Thomas with an infectious laugh that could lighten any mood, Henry and Eliza watched with pride as their family became the living embodiment of their love. The Double P Ranch became known throughout Colorado not just for its fine cattle but for its hospitality and the strong family at its center. Travelers passing through Silverton often heard tales of the Porters, how the ranch owner had married a woman he'd caught stealing bread, how their love story had become the stuff of local legend. On their 10th wedding anniversary, with their children asleep upstairs and the ranch quiet under a blanket of stars, Henry presented Eliza with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, turning the beautifully carved container in her hands. "Open it," Henry encouraged, his eyes warm with love. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay the loaf of bread, or rather, a perfect miniature replica carved from wood and painted to look remarkably realistic. "To remember how our story began," Henry explained. "I commissioned it from that wood carver in Denver." Tears filled Eliza's eyes as she carefully lifted the carving. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and a much better keepsake than actual decade-old bread would be." Henry laughed, drawing her into his arms. "I love you, Eliza Porter, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," Eliza replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "My rescuer, my partner, my heart." As they stood together in the home they had built, surrounded by the evidence of their love and hard work, Eliza reflected that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the most unlikely beginnings. A desperate act, a moment of kindness, and the courage to believe in second chances had given her everything she'd ever wanted, and so much more that she hadn't known to dream of. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the Double P prospered, as silver hair gradually replaced auburn, and the lines around their eyes deepened with laughter and experience, the love that had begun that day in Silverton only grew stronger, a testament to the power of compassion, second chances, and hearts that recognize their match even in the most unexpected circumstances. The story of Eliza and Henry Porter became part of the fabric of Silverton, and the surrounding areas told and retold, embellished sometimes but always returning to the simple truth that the greatest theft ever committed at the Double P Ranch was not of bread or cattle or gold, but of two hearts that had found in each other the home they'd always been seeking.